interviewing you. So I'm sitting down with Wafa Tarnowska. She is an author and storyteller. She recently published Amazing Women of the Middle East, 25 Stories from Ancient Times to Present Day. Hi, Wafa. Thank you for joining me. I wanted to start off by just kind of asking you if you wanted to tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of your creative process and how you became an author and storyteller.
Well, I've always wanted to be a writer, but as parents often tell their children not to do what they often want to do, it took me a little while to really focus completely on writing and storytelling. So my journey wasn't straight into writing. I started off writing, but as a radio broadcaster and translating. I worked in Australia as a radio broadcaster for about 8 years. And then I was a teacher when my kids were little, again with languages. So everything has to do with words. And then when my kids were little, what happened is we were posted in Cyprus because my husband was foreign correspondent and we traveled all over the world. And they asked me one day, they came back from school and they said, "Mommy, do you have any stories from your country about gods and goddesses?" And they were like 10 years old, 11 years old. And I said, "Yes, we do." They said, "How come we don't learn about them at school?" Well, we were in Cyprus, and of course, they were learning about Greek myths. So Aphrodite's and Apollo and etc. So I just started telling my children stories about Phoenician myths. And I loved it so much that I said to myself, I have to write a book about it. And that's how the first book started. I went to this publisher in Cyprus and I said, "Look, we need to write about these myths. They precede Greek myths, and they have a lot of relationship with Greek myths, and let's do it." And that's how it started. So 20 years ago, I started writing, and it's been an amazing journey.
Thank you. Yeah, we actually wanted to ask you, so your earlier books were children's books, and so kind of these classic Middle Eastern tales like 1001 Nights and Arabian Fables. So we were wondering if these were these the stories you grew up with, and kind of what inspired you to decide to share them with the world and kind of introduce children both, throughout the region, but also throughout the world to these stories.
Well, basically, I definitely write to children who have an interest in the Middle East, or maybe their parents are from the Middle East, similar to my children. I mean, my children are half Middle Eastern, half Polish. So I definitely write to this kind of audience. And as I said, I started with Phoenician myths, and then I moved on to a Persian story, which is one of my favorite books, The Seven Wise Princesses, which is a Persian Sufi poem, which I researched in Cambridge. And it was a poem I rewrote in prose, and I was very, very much influenced by all the manuscripts, which I saw at the Cambridge Library. And then from that, I moved on to the Arabian Nights. And the Arabian Nights, well, that definitely has something to do with my childhood, because my grandma was an amazing storyteller. She used to sit us when we were kids. When she came to visit us, she didn't live with us, but she visited us. She always had a bag full of chocolates from all the visits she did. And so after we ate the chocolates in the bag, which had no money, just chocolates, basically. She had maybe a tissue and chocolates. And after that, we sat and we listened to these stories, and I loved them. And she used to hold my hand and were telling me, and we sat on her bed, and she would tell me the stories, and they were very magical. And I realized when I read the 200 stories of the Arabian Nights, when I was preparing for my Arabian Nights book, that some of the stories my grandma told me were from the Arabian Nights. That's why I dedicated it to her, the book. So she is the storyteller. And then after that, the 25 women that I have just chosen, well, some of them are historic. But then I thought it's time for me to step into active role models that young girls and even boys can actually relate to. Because it's lovely to have historic, it's lovely to read biographies. I don't think there is something more inspiring than reality. And, you know, these women, like 15 of them, you can Google, you can go on YouTube and you can see them, they're alive. And in fact, that's how I did a lot of the research, by going on YouTube and listening to their interviews and translating some of the interviews from Arabic to English and from French to English. And of course, going to Arabic sources. And so it was a very, very interesting process, that last book, and I loved it. But if you notice, I still wrote it in a bit of a storytelling way. I didn't do it like a school book. It was like as if I am telling a story to, let's say, my future grandchild or something like this.
Yes, so storytelling really seems to run in your family. Yeah,
Yes.
Just kind of continuing that tradition and sharing both kind of the classical Middle Eastern tales, but then also sharing stories from today, like you said, with you know, stories of women in the region today who are kind of trailblazing and really making waves. That kind of leads me into my next question, which was, so you kind of shift from, you know, doing children's books that are kind of fictional and, you know, classic stories, very magical, which, you know, are so interesting for children. And yeah, I mean, I need to read more about these. These just sound so interesting. But so you kind of shift into more of a nonfiction realm with this new book. So what kind of inspired this shift? I mean, you mentioned that you wanted to kind of talk more about, you know, modern or role models that could inspire girls and boys across the world. But was there any other reason kind of for the shift to more fictional storytelling?
I admire these women personally. These women were my role models, some of them, when I was growing up. For instance, when I was a young journalist in the beginning of my career, you know, I was a radio broadcaster. I managed to interview Anbara Saram al-Khalidi before she died. And she is in my book. And she's an amazing woman. I mean, she was a translator and she was a blazing feminist at the beginning of the 20th century. And she comes from a very illustrious family in Lebanon of politicians. So she really stuck her neck out. She helped lots of refugees. She was a very multifaceted person. And then she went to Palestine. And then so she's a really interesting woman, plus a linguist. I mean, I think that it's really funny. A lot of the women that are in my book are linguists, and I'm a linguist. It seems like, I don't know, it makes you a little bit more bold because every time you learn a new language, you adopt a new way of thinking, a new way of seeing things, and also a new way of understanding about the world from that language point of view. So I noticed that a lot of my heroines, even Cleopatra, was a linguist. I mean, she did not only speak Greek, she also spoke ancient Egyptian and other languages of her time. Zenobia spoke many languages. I mean, many of them speak many languages. I mean, Amal Clooney, she's trilingual. She speaks Arabic, French, and English, like many Lebanese. So, you know, I don't know if it has something to do with languages, but I found that a very fascinating thread. And also, some women I have just been following for a while, their ascend and their success. And so for instance, one of them is Azza Fahmi. She's in my book. She's an Egyptian jeweler. And I loved her jewelry. I mean, for one of my anniversaries, I told my children I want a bracelet. And they all chipped in to get me the bracelet. The reason why I wanted that bracelet was because she writes poetry. It's all carved in the bracelet. And she writes beautiful verses of Arabic poetry in her jewelry. And I wanted something Arabic. I'm always wanting something Arabic. I've lived so long in the West that anything Arabic just kind of makes me happy. Whether it's a piece of halwa, whether it's a piece of jewelry with this kind of, you know, Arabic verse, whatever it is. So that's how I started with Azza. I admired her work. And then when I saw her journey, I realized, wow. I mean, she was the first woman who went into Khan al-Khalili in Egypt and trained to become a jeweler with the men. There was no men in those days learning how to do the jewelry as apprentice. No women, only the men. And she was the first woman to do so. And all of these women, wherever they are, from all the parts of the Arab world, they did things that others didn't dare do or were afraid to do. But they didn't do it in a defying way. They just had this inner sense of, I don't know, is this like they had a guiding star or something? They really felt guided to continue on that journey, despite all obstacles, and eventually they succeed.
Yes, wow. Yeah, it actually, that's fascinating with her kind of training with men and really kind of both kind of challenging tradition, but working within it to kind of, just kind of achieve something really great. So thank you for sharing that. That actually kind of brings up another question that I had, which was, what was kind of your criteria for selecting the women featured in Amazing Women of the Middle East? Was it just, kind of, and I'm sure being limited to 25, it was very difficult to select only 25. So what was kind of the criteria? And then I also wanted to know kind of, was there anyone that you left out that you wish you had been able to include?
That's a beautiful question. Yes, it was very difficult to choose, but I think my criteria was smorgasbord, mezze, as we have in the Arabic world. I didn't want just activists or politicians or queens. I wanted as many different professions as possible. So actually, young people would identify. So we had the ice skater from the Emirates, we had the pilot from Oman, we had the mathematician from Yemen. So as many professions as possible. I mean, Salwa Rawda Shuqair, who became famous at 94, I mean, she worked for 60 years in the shadows, sculpting and painting and doing her abstract work without recognition. And she only got recognized at 94. That's another criteria, resilience. So basically, smorgasbord and resilience. I mean, Salwa Rawda Shuqair could have just died without actually being known outside the Arab world. Just happened at 94, somebody from the Tate Modern, was going to the Middle East to look for new talents. And somebody told her about this woman, this old woman sitting in her, house, having worked 60 years in the shadows. And she went to look at her art and she was absolutely astounded. And they did this huge exhibition at the Tate Modern and it was a bestseller. And she died like age 100, but she was only famous the last 6 years of her life. I mean, 60 years of working in the shadows, that's resiliency. So for me, it's variety, resiliency, believe in yourself. That's very important for young people to know that they need to trust their inner voice that we often tend to shut down because of family, society, teachers. I think that inner voice is a very, very important voice to listen to. And also, I think belief in that what they're doing is worthwhile. I mean, I tell my children, you can do whatever you want to do as long as you believe that what you're doing is good for humanity. Then just get on with it and do it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great criteria. I'm sure it's so difficult to, select only. I'm sure there's so many stories that you wish you had also been able to include.
Yes, you're right. I forgot about that part of the question.
No worries.
The one I absolutely wanted very much to include was the equivalent of Fairuz in Egypt, Kulthum. I loved Kulthum. I mean, Anta Umri, her songs are astounding. And she was a diva, just like Fairuz. There was just no place for two singers in the book. And we had to choose a singer, and Fairuz was alive. And in fact, at the end, I think my choice was justified when Macron, just a few weeks ago, gave her the Chevalier d'Honneur, they gave her the highest medal in France, just a few months ago. She was chosen. She wasn't chosen. He didn't choose politicians. He didn't choose any person in Lebanon but her to give that medal to, because she had united Lebanon for so long with her songs. Lebanon is a very troubled and difficult country to manage, but Fayrouz's songs unite not only Lebanon, they actually unite the Arab world because they appeal to everybody, to young and old. So at the end, I chose Fayrouz. Plus, there is a distant family relation between us. So I actually knew her as well. As a child, I had gone to her concert. I had met her a few times personally. But I wish I had the space for Kulthum. And of course, there are amazing Arab women. You have no idea, Alison. Amazing. It's just that the media only tends to show the ones that are downtrodden, or the complete opposite, the ones that are the lascivious, the odalisque. It's these two poles about the image of Arab women, either the downtrodden, poor women, or the seductresses that you can't stop from seducing, which is, in the paintings of Matisse with the odalisque and these beautiful women, lying on their backs with cushions and semi-naked. So between these two extremes, there is a variety of amazing women. That is my opinion anyway.
Yes, definitely. I think your book really kind of does challenge those stereotypes and kind of shows us that, the Middle Eastern women have for centuries been so empowered, and from, Zenobia to women today. I definitely want to come back and touch on this, but I actually had another question, which was, did you happen to choose any women because they were living, and did you interview any women for this book, or was it just kind of research that you kind of conducted on your own?
No, we didn't have the funds to interview. I did the research, but very extensive. You have no idea how many videos they were being interviewed by others, by reputed TV stations and radio stations. And I listened and I saw, so I didn't have to do it myself. The only person I actually tried very, very much to get in touch with, to get her blessing, was Amal Clooney, because she's Lebanese like me, and I admire her work tremendously. I would have loved to have a little endorsement from her or a sign. We tried very hard, and her PR didn't answer. So I would have loved to have had that personal, maybe one day we'll have that. But at the moment, the beautiful thing about the internet is that there is so much. And you can double check, triple check. Every fact has been triple, quadruple, quintuple checked, not just by me, by my editor. And then we actually hired a fact checker that we paid money to. So even down to the birth dates, we had even a question about a couple of people because they didn't have their birth dates on the media or on their public CV. And so, it took me a long time to find the birth dates of a couple of these people. So it's really, really good research. Plus, my training is, one, I used to be a broadcaster and a media person. And two, I'm also a sociologist. So I am trained to do research.
Yeah, your research process sounds so extensive. What can you kind of walk me through it a little bit, and kind of how you started the research, kind of how you, I'm sure there's so many kind of different figures to go through and kind of a lot of vetting and to see where you could get the most information for which figures. So could you just walk me through that process a little bit?
Well, we wanted 1,000 words on each woman. So, there is so much on these women. I had to really distill it into the essence of the women. And as a friend of mine who read the book, and English is not her first language. She said she really enjoyed it. She's a French educated, because she said every line has one information. So I tried and put practically every sentence had a new information in it. That was the technique. I mean, as I said, every woman took me 3 days of research.
Wow.
You know, from YouTube to actual newspaper articles to encyclopedias. A lot of the encyclopedias now are online, you know. So yeah, it was actually quite extensive. And in 3 languages, I did the research: Arabic, French, and English.
Wow.
And so, like Anbara Salam al-Khalidi, she interviewed in Arabic. So I read a lot of things. She has a beautiful radio interview before she died in Arabic, which is quite long. Fantastic. And so I took a lot of notes from Arabic and I translate. I'm a translator as well. So I translated myself a lot of those notes and of the information. And as I said, then the editor had a look, and then the fact checker had a look. So there were 3-pronged process to every person.
Wow, yeah. And I'm sure just kind of, you know, being able to distill all that information into just 1,000 words for each woman was so difficult, because I'm sure there's so much you can say about each of them. So that brings up a question that I had about, was there anyone that really kind of surprised you, any kind of lesser known story? I mean, I'm sure getting into all of the research for each figure, there are so many stories, so I'm sure it's very hard to pick one. But was there anything that really stood out to you and really surprised you about any of the figures?
I think, funnily enough, Anousheh Ansari actually surprised me. She's the woman who was the first astronaut, tourist woman, Muslim astronaut in the world. I mean, she trained as an engineer, and she was quite successful as an engineer. I mean, she went to the USA as a young child. She was only like 6. She did not learn English. She didn't know English. So she went just having known Persian. And then she studied very hard. And she said that when she was a little girl, she used to look at the stars. And she always dreamt that one day she was going to go and travel to the stars. And then to do it, what surprised me is that she didn't do it through the NASA way, for instance. She did it through the way that now a lot of people will be able to do it. You know, there's all these space programs that are focused on tourism, not just on, but then when she was there, I mean, she was able to raise the money to go as the first space tourist, woman Muslim. And then when she was there, she did some scientific research. That surprised me. I just thought, because she dreamt of doing it, she was going to go and have fun. In fact, no, she was actually working at the space station, doing research on a couple of matters. And that I found astounding. And then coming back, she goes all around the schools, lecturing about women in STEM subjects, how women can actually do things that are not usually thought of as feminine, you know, like engineering and all these science professions that women usually don't tend to go to. And I think for me, that was very, very surprising. The other person who was actually quite amazing is the Yemeni woman who was the genius. And she was, I mean, the amount of things that she does is quite extraordinary. And I was thinking, how does anybody do so much in one lifetime? I mean, there's like, if you look at her website, I mean, some of these women have their own websites. If you look at her website, it would take you a week just to go through the website because of all the achievements she had done. So, you know, yes, I was surprised. I mean, we had decided on her because of her being a mathematician and a genius, one of the 0.0% of these geniuses in the world, Mensa. But then, wow, all the things that she's into. So yeah, these 2 women, I think, definitely surprised me.
Wow.
After I had agreed to do it, and then finding out how extensive their work and knowledge is, and how admirable it is, because it's in very men kind of dominated areas.
Absolutely. We actually just had the Day of Women and Girls in STEM. So this is Mana Health Thabet, right, that you're talking about. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. But we actually featured her in a post, and she's done so much, and she's so young. So just these women are so amazing, and I think the more you learn about them and what they've done, you just astounded, because they've done, so many of them have done so much in such a short period of time.
Exactly. And you know what I also found, Alison, is that they are quite modest. It's amazing how modest they are. They don't brag, they just get on with it and they do it. And I just find maybe that's a sign of being a genius, is like, don't talk, just get on with it and just do it. Because honestly, you meeting them, you think you could have a coffee with them. They're really so not pretentious. And then you discover all the things they've done, and they're still not pretentious. It's like, wow. You know how sometimes people ask you, what is your ideal dinner date? You know, they have these questions in the magazines. Honestly, I would like to have all 25 of them attend the banquet, and I just would love to see what would happen at this banquet, of these 25 amazing women. It would be quite an amazing occasion, I can tell you that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I know the historical figure, that's going to be my answer now, is to that question, who would you have a dinner date? I'm going to steal from you and say those 25 women, because they're so interesting. I actually so I've noticed kind of throughout us talking that you have such a good way to describe you are a storyteller. You're just kind of, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second, but that you're just you're just kind of talking about these women, and it's such you're kind of weaving these stories about them, and it's really interesting. So I kind of wanted to just talk about that, and how you see yourself as a storyteller. I know that on your website it says you're a writer, a translator, and a storyteller. So kind of what does being a storyteller, what does that mean to you? And maybe why do you use this term rather than author?
Yes. Okay. Now, a storyteller is different from a writer or an author. The storyteller is verbal, and usually it's not their own stories. They're taking a story from some ancient tradition and they're retelling it in their own way. And storytelling is an art because it's like a bit of a performance. I mean, you can't just have I change my voice. I sometimes use props. When I go to schools, I put on various headdresses. I have a little bit of drumming things. And so it's a little bit of a performance. Whereas writing is a completely, although I could be taking that story from another context, from another book, but I make it mine. The words are mine. The structure is somebody else's, but the story ends up being mine. You read the Arabian Nights in the traditional, let's say, Burton's 19th century, tome, and then you read mine and they're really different. So you can feel my personality in my story. So I think the difference between storyteller and writer is that the writer tends to do it, in a book or maybe, but not as a performer. I think the storyteller is the performance, is the enjoyment of the performance. I really like telling stories. I mean, even if I'm at a dinner table, I would always tell funny stories about things that happened to me or to my children or in my travels. It's just a way, and maybe it's genetic. As I said, my grandma was one. My father was an amazing joker. I mean, he's a lawyer and a poet, but he was very fun. And he used to tell fantastically fun stories at dinner table. So maybe it's in my genes. I haven't got a clue, but it's different from writing, that's for sure.
Yes, I definitely, it is an art, and I think a lot of people sometimes tend to think that, it's not, and it's just, but it is such a performance and it is such an art. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, and it's very interesting to kind of.
And I say something. I mean, in the Arab world, it's a tradition. Hakawati. We have a name for it. A hakawati is a storyteller, and the hakawati can be male or female. There's no difference. Male, usually in public spaces, like they go and tell the stories publicly in cafes. But the female storyteller would tell them within the family gathering, within a wedding, maybe inside their houses. So it is a profession. I mean, it should be a profession.
Yeah,
it should be.
Absolutely.
It's a beautiful profession. And you know what? I'm a bit of a Renaissance person. I do not believe in specialization. As I said, I did quite a bit of things before I reached this tripod life, in which sometimes I translate. Sometimes I have to translate for my work because some of the sources are in Arabic or French. And often I translate for others for being paid. I did a lot of films for famous TV stations. And second is my writing. And third is my storytelling. It's like a triptych. And I think it blends very well. And it makes me very happy.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the creative process of creating the book. So I know you worked with a lot of kind of renowned illustrators. What was kind of the process of working with them like, and were they kind of given, their kind of very much creative freedom, or did you get to have any input or say in the illustrations for the book?
I think this comes down to the genius of my UK publisher, Eleanor Sapsford. She chose 5 amazing women illustrators. She gave them each 5 heroines. And I don't know, the choice of these illustrators was so spot on. When I saw the illustrations, I was like astounded. There was nothing I could comment on or criticize. They just seem to have just swam with it. It's not always the same with all the books I've written. Sometimes I have to go back to the illustrator, say, look, this doesn't work. Like, I don't want you to put a veiled woman, because I don't want people to think that all Arab women are veiled women. There is a smorgasbord. You've got the veiled, you've got the non-veiled. So please remove that. Or, sometimes putting caricatures in some of the illustrations. I don't like that. But in the case of this book, I had nothing. They were just swimming with it. They embraced it. They felt, and their methods are different, but they all blend so well together. That was astounding. They blend together. You don't feel like it's 5 different illustrators. And I think that the colorful mise en page, the setting by Rachel, who's an amazing also, she did a really wonderful work on the kind of editing physically the book with all these bright, alluring, happy colors. I think they all blended so well. I mean, honestly, it was a breeze, that creative process. I think the most difficulty we had was the fact checking, because of the fact that 15 of them were alive, and we wanted to make sure that we were not going to be in a jeopardy. So that was the most difficult thing in writing the book, is the fact checking.
Yeah. Wow. I really like how not only kind of the book is about, these empowered female creators and historical figures and scientists, but that, you as a storyteller and these women as artists are also kind of, just in bringing all of them together, they also kind of, you're inspirational, and the illustrators are, inspire other young girls who, want to become illustrators. So it sounds like such a collaborative female effort.
Yes, more than that, Alison. Actually, for the launch of the book, 20th of September, I invited one of the illustrators for my launch. So we didn't know each other then, but and there was no recording of the launch. But basically, one of the illustrators from Lebanon came on board, and she was part of the launch. I mean, we chose because it just happened at the time after Beirut was destroyed, basically, and I wanted very much to show my support for my city of birth. And so her name was Christelle Halal. So she was part of the launch. And in another, and I mean, so basically, and we talked about the creative process, about how she went about drawing and finding little details to illustrate every woman. And people loved that in the launch. And then I had another Zoom for a library in New York. And this time I invited my editor who lives in New York. And we talked about the editing process. So, you know, I'm a very collaborative person. I tend to thank the people to do the work that they did. Because writing a book is not just a lonely affair. It's also a teamwork. You know, you need to get on well with your editor, with your publisher, with your illustrators, and hopefully with your readers. You know, it's very much a teamwork. It's very much a teamwork. So yeah, that is what I wanted to say.
Yeah, so thank you for just giving kind of a glimpse into this creative process. I think it's so interesting, and I think a lot of people don't, know a lot about the work that goes into creating a book and kind of the collaboration that's required. So thank you for sharing that.
Not just collaboration, you need to have no ego. I mean, the editors I work with, and you know, I've worked with 3 or 4 publishing houses. They are, I think, happy with me, because when they ask me to do something, I rarely object. I always try and see their point of view, because they have the wider vision. And I try and, you know, I say to myself, a good process is not to have an ego, not to think I'm always right. You know, so it's really collaborative. I mean, I've just finished writing 2 stories with Barefoot Books, which is my other publisher. And it's been very much a collaborative process. It's like tweaking here and understanding how the reader would perceive something I would write. And you know, it makes you a better writer when you don't have an ego.
Mm-hmm.
It really does.
Yeah, so actually one of my last questions was, are you able to kind of share anything in the works? So I know you mentioned that you have something coming up in November. Are you able to share anything about that, or not to pressure you, but what do you kind of have in the works?
Well, in the works, I've got a beautiful story, which is inspired a little bit by my experiences in the civil war in Lebanon, and a little bit by the war in Syria. It took me 40 years to be able to talk about a war story. I did not want it to be a victim story, as most war stories are. It took me a long time to be able to write a story, to have a good ending despite the subject, which is the war and destruction. And it is a story with a beautiful message and a beautiful ending, but it is set in a war. And it's based on my own experiences. So it took me a little while to cook it, but it's going to be a beautiful, it's only a 1 story. It's the first time I do, usually I do compilations. This is the first time I do a 1 story book. So every page has an illustration. It's going to be really exciting, and it's with Barefoot Books, and it's coming out in the fall. We're you know, I am sure that people will resonate with it, and young people will learn a little bit about what it is to be a child of war. In fact, I've dedicated it to all the children who have suffered war, because there are so many children who have suffered war on this planet. And anyway, so yeah, this is a new project I have.
Yeah, I think it's also coming from kind of more of a Western perspective, I think that it's often not discussed. I never really learned anything about the Lebanese Civil War, in school. So I think that and I know that you mentioned that kind of your audience is both children who have like a Middle Eastern background, but also Western audiences, to kind of introduce them to stories in the Middle East and the history and the culture. So I really look forward to seeing that out in November, as you said. And that actually kind of leads me into another question I had, kind of about the misconceptions of women in the Middle East, and how do you kind of hope that this book will challenge those stereotypes, especially with your audiences in the West?
It's already challenged quite a few misconceptions. I mean, I did lots of interviews when it came out, and everybody was asking me that question. How are you really trying to challenge the misconceptions? I said, yes, a resounding yes, because even people who ask me, where do you come from? I mean, like, I've been 40 years in the West. I've got a slight accent, I know that. But you know what? They're always surprised I'm from the Middle East, because I don't look that Middle Eastern. I don't know what I look. I look Mediterranean. But what I'm saying is that even people have physical conceptions of people from the Middle East, let alone how people dress in the Middle East, let alone how people behave in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And I like, I was never a person of rah, burn your bra, ever. I mean, I studied, my sub-major was women's studies, in sociology. So I've always admired women who broke the glass ceiling. But I never wanted to do it in opposition to the male. I wanted to do it as a balance, to balance back the imbalance that I see in society, mm-hmm. where males have the voice and males have the power. And then if we balance it and women have more voice and women are starting to have more power, I think we can see a much, much better society going forward. So this is how I like to address the situation, not from a victim point of view, but mm-hmm. from a rebalancing of the scales that were tipped very much. I mean, even Hollywood was full of stereotypes about Middle Eastern women and Middle Eastern men. Mm-hmm. I hope one day we're going to see a film in Hollywood that shows a Middle Eastern woman or a Middle Eastern man, actually, in a way more subtle, I wish we would find a Middle Eastern Meryl Streep to show these nuances of Middle Eastern women. That would be absolutely amazing, Yeah. So this is my hope in life, is to have a balance and also to open people's eyes on the complexity of the situation. It's not black and white. It really is not black and white, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even kind of with the historical figures as well, it's kind of, it's not a rewriting of history, but it's just kind of bringing up a history that, is often forgotten, that, there were these really empowered women, and that even though, there's a lot of historical injustice against women, it's also, there are such powerful female figures, and it wasn't always just kind of victimhood. And so, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
Or in the case of Cleopatra, she's the vixen.
Yes,
she's the one who tried to seduce two powerful Roman men. But what Cleopatra did was she wanted to protect her country. And she just used her wit. She wasn't even that beautiful in reality. It's more of a hearsay. She was incredibly intelligent and entertaining, but she wasn't that stunning. She was just an interesting woman to be with. And of course, men love intelligent women. So, so she seduced two amazing men, but she didn't do it because of seduction. She did it because she loved Egypt. She wanted to protect Egypt, and she wanted to continue her her family's lineage, the Ptolemies. Mm-hmm. So that's how I see Cleopatra. I don't see her as what the West sees her, as the seductress. I see her as the last female pharaoh of Egypt,
Yes. Absolutely, kind of the two poles that people tend to see, like you talked about earlier, and kind of, there is it's not these two extremes, you know, there's women exist all across kind of like a spectrum, and it's very stereotypical to see kind of either as victim or as you know, this temptress, as often has been portrayed in a, like you said, with Matisse and the Odalisque. And so yeah, so I think really kind of just challenging that, and you know, being accurate about kind of what happened in the past and what's happening now. So my last question is, so to let you go, but my last question is, do you have kind of a takeaway for reader? What is, you've kind of already touched on this, but what kind of one thing would you want readers to take away, kind of both your younger audiences, but also like older audiences?
Yes, I want a reader to ask themselves, what am I passionate about? Because your passion will lead you to your purpose, you know. So don't listen. I tell a lot of people, and they get very upset when I say when I go lecturing in schools and doing storytelling events, I tell the students, don't listen to your parents, don't listen to your teachers. And I'm not very popular when I say that. I said, listen to your inner voice. What are you passionate about? Do it, you know, do it, because that will lead you to a beautiful life. That is what these women were passionate about, something, each one in a different way. And that's what led to their success and to their uniqueness. And I also would like to tell the readers that, you know what, being open to the variety that life has to offer. I mean, these women, as I said, they offer a smorgasbord, a meze. You can be from a mathematician to an ice skater to an architect to a translator. You can be so many things. You can be a pilot, like, you know, the Yemeni woman. So what is your passion? That's what the bottom line is. What is our passion? And if we're doing our passion, we're happy and we're doing it well, you know. And it's not easy, but things get easier. The more you're into doing your passion, the more you're into the road of your passion, the more things get easier and effortless, and ease and grace, I say. I really believe that very, very much. Ease and grace will come the minute that you commit to your passion. That's the takeaway.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course.